Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Good morning, everyone. So I'm very pleased to start our second day of our workshop. So a busy agenda like yesterday, many interesting panels. We have two panels in the morning, we'll have a break for lunch, and then we'll have a panel in the afternoon. So thanks again for those joining us in Montreal and those joining us online, participants and panelists. Yesterday was a day full of discussions, and we learned a lot from the different panels and the different experts that we had in the room and online. Thank you for sticking with us all day long and participating with your questions. So we hope for an enriching day as well, lots of exciting, insightful discussions. So I'm very happy to welcome the first panel. I think most people are with us here in Montreal and some people online. So the first panel will be on comparative perspectives and case studies. It will highlight diverse experiences and approaches to climate litigation and reparations from different jurisdictions. So the moderator is Olivier Nfago, who will be joining us in Montreal. And we have the pleasure to welcome Jamila Joy Reyes, who I think is joining us online from the Manila Observatory. And he is a member of one of our partners, Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment, GNHRE. And he'll be presenting loss and damage in the highlands, perspectives from indigenous farmers in Atok Benguet. Then we'll be welcoming Alana Malinde Lancaster. She's a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, and she'll be presenting on representation, redress, and reparatory justice, the case of the Afro-descendant peoples of the Caribbean small island developing states. And then Vicky Capogiani, who's a lecturer from the University of Reading, and Eric Lufland, I think he's online, right? So she's a lecturer at the University of Kent. Eric Lufland is a lecturer at the University of Kent, and Vicky Capogiani is a lecturer at the University of Reading. And they'll be presenting on the topic from genocide-enabled domination to climate vulnerability to new horizons of responsibility, the question of reparations in the case of the Caribbean. And last but not least, Barrett Ristroff, lawyer at Ristroff Law, and he'll be presenting balancing human rights with custom and Pacific Island community adaptation and relocation. So without further ado, I welcome the first panelists, the first panel, and we can take the seat.
I'm Olivier Apogo, and I have the responsibility to moderate this panel. We have the first panelist is Jamila Joy Reyes. I think she's online, right?
Yeah, she's already there.
Okay, right. Then we can welcome Reyes. We can let you begin your presentation, please.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Olivier. And thank you, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope that that's visible. And so let me know if there are any concerns with this screen. Is everything okay?
Okay.
Yes? Yes. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So hello, everyone. Isang mapagpalayang umaga sa inyong lahat. A liberating morning, afternoon, evening to everyone here today. Thank you for having me. Thank you to the organizers for allowing me to be in the presence of such wonderful discussants and panelists. And I'm really, really grateful for the opportunity to share our insights about Highland perspectives on Indigenous, on loss and damage. And yesterday provided overviews and legal frameworks, and hopefully today we get to delve deeper into lived experiences on the ground. And I'm very, very humbled to be starting off and kickstarting this conversation. So this paper, which we originally envisioned to be loss and damage in the highlands, perspectives from Indigenous farmers in Atok Benguet, we have kind of shifted gears with my co-authors, and now it's called Injustice, Crisis, and Ways of Repair, Loss and Damage in the Highlands. And that's also a callback kind of to the loss and damage collaborations work on reparation and reparative justice. And this is grounded in empirical fieldwork that we've conducted in Atok Benguet over the months of May to July 2024, which is a highland municipality in the northern part of the country. The study focuses on the lived experiences of indigenous Ibaloi and Kangkanae farmers as they navigate the compounding pressures of climate change on one hand, market volatility on the other, as well as sociopolitical marginalization. And at the center of this investigation is the framework of loss and damage. And so our paper, which is currently still in the process of being written, has four main viewpoints. Number one, that indigenous farmers in Atok Benguet incur significant physical and sociocultural loss and damage. We've had the conversation on loss and damage yesterday, and throughout the paper and throughout my presentation, I will refer to them as not just economic and non-economic, but physical and sociocultural loss and damage, under the assumption that not everything can be quantified. Number two, although farmers strive to adapt and repair loss and damage, maladaptive practices as well as changing cultural values make that difficult. Third, climate impacts cannot be divorced from socioeconomic intricacies as well as historical experiences. And fourth, reparations must empower indigenous farmers and acknowledge the wider web of climate, economic, cultural, and historical injustices that attend their lived experience. The Atok case makes clear that for these marginalized communities, particularly indigenous ones in the Philippines, the impacts of the climate crisis are not merely material, but also very deeply cultural. So, in Atok, farmers have long relied, which is a fourth-class municipality in the Cordillera Mountain Range in the Philippines, farmers have long relied on traditional ecological knowledge systems in order to guide their agricultural decision-making. So they would use ecological cues, natural indicators such as migration of birds, movement of fogs, or the existence of clouds in order to determine seasonal shifts. These practices, which have been rooted in centuries of observation as well as storytelling, have historically enabled resilience and adaptive capacity of the communities. However, with the increasing unpredictability of climate patterns, as well as the climate crisis with which we are confronted, these knowledge systems have then become less reliable. And what was once a finely tuned system of ecological cues is now misaligned with actual weather events. And so the main research question that we had when we were drafting the paper was, how do indigenous farmers in Atok adapt to climate-induced challenges while preserving their cultural and ecological practices? And in order to answer this research question, we use the power of narratives and the politics of repair. We use the concept of climate storylines, which we believe are a good way to fill in the gaps in climate repair and provides a bottom-up approach in the discourse where we're able to kind of center and amplify the voices and narratives of indigenous communities, something that is not often the case. And so when we went to the fieldwork, we asked them what they thought climate change meant to them, how their farming practices have shifted over the years, if they have, how has COVID attended that as well, what their exposures, vulnerabilities, and adaptive practices were, the kinds of climate impacts that they faced, as well as the kinds of post-disaster assistance that they receive, and whether or not these are in line with what they actually need. So we thought that storytelling was very, very potent in the discussion. And so what we found was that farmers report significant climate disruptions. For instance, frost now occur as late as March, which has traditionally marked the start of the dry season. And some of the farmers that we've talked to actually said about how mainstream media, urban media, have essentialized and sensationalized frost, even though this is something that communities have learned to deal with because of the many years that they've been living there. Normally, what they do is that they just save what can be saved, harvest what can be harvested, etc. Monsoon rains as well have become more erratic, leading to uncertainty in planting cycles. Rising average temperatures have reduced labor productivity. So many of the farmers we've talked to talked about how they used to be able to work upwards of 12 hours per day, but now will have to keep tabs on how long they spend under the sun. And if you think about how this area is noted for its temperate, moderate weather, then that is definitely something that has to be kept in mind. As a result, cropping cycles have decreased, pest infestations have become more common and crop damage has intensified. Some have managed to grow new crops, which are adaptive to warmer climates, but these adjustments are largely insufficient to offset the broader decline in agricultural viability. What this does show, however, is that indigenous peoples, indigenous farmers more specifically, have always been adept at adapting. And these climatic disruptions are deeply entangled with economic, political, and structural factors, right? Market conditions, such as the liberalization of vegetable imports, price instability, and smuggling, which have been the case in the area, have severely undermined local livelihoods. When you think of the geography of the Philippines, Atok Benguet is around 7 to 10 hours away from Manila, and therefore even that is the geographical distance also means that their local livelihoods are undermined because of the influx of importation and smuggling. Therefore, farmers often find themselves discarding surplus produce or abandoning traditional crops in favor of floriculture, flower tourism, or other tourism-oriented enterprises, which not only reduce income stability, but also erode intergenerational knowledge transfer, which threatens the continuity of indigenous agricultural heritage. Many of the farmers we talked to, many of whom were parents, said that because of the uncertainty of farming as a livelihood, they have been advising their children to take up farming only as a livelihood of last resort. This is also particularly relevant because in response to these challenges, farmers started to rely heavily on informal and community-based risk-sharing systems. And while these systems are rooted in indigenous social structures and offer critical support, they remain structurally limited. They're often inaccessible to smaller scale or organic farmers, particularly women, and they're not adequate in addressing systemic and large-scale losses, particularly after disasters. This then provides an even deeper and more complex lens to view the discussion, because it's mostly women and mostly organic farmers who are also those who are undergoing the most labor-intensive work, and therefore would be in most need of aid. Formal mechanisms, on the other hand, tend to be misaligned and inaccessible. Government aid, for instance, from what we have learned, is frequently mismatched to local conditions. They would ask for seeds, they would be given greenhouses or tractors, not things that they need in their line of work. The seed distributions that they do receive do not correspond to locally adapted varieties, those that they are used to growing. Insurance schemes are difficult to access and favor commercial operations over subsistence and organic farmers. And in so many cases, therefore, government aid, the ways that government help in rehabilitation, restoring post-disaster, and even amidst the climate crisis, the programs actually exacerbate existing inequalities rather than resolve them. So it's also important that even informal and community-based risk-sharing mechanisms prioritize bigger farms over smallholders, which then replicates, perhaps unintentionally, the very issues that they are seeking to avoid in the first place. And I guess all of these things, the physical and socioeconomic costs, adaptation and maladaptation, as well as intense socioeconomic pressures, must be understood within a broader historical and political economic context. After Spain, the USA colonized us. And so the reorientation of highland agriculture has been a result of American colonial rule, which has shifted local production toward export-oriented crops such as lettuce, cabbages, and carrots, none of which are part of the indigenous diet, which then shifted local production or has created structural dependence on volatile markets and external demand. Therefore, for the indigenous farmers, for many of them, farming has ceased to be a culturally embedded practice and has thus become primarily an economic survival strategy. In this context, climate-induced loss and damage represents not just environmental degradation, but also the continuation of historical disempowerment amongst indigenous peoples. And so to close my discussion, we did propose several points of intervention, my co-authors and I. First, we argue that indigenous knowledge systems must be formally recognized and integrated into climate adaptation planning, particularly in localized weather forecasting. So one of the farmers we talked to said that they would just listen to the wind and use their phones in the process and see whether or not frost will take place. If they know that frost will take place, they already know which mitigation measures to do. So many of those respondents have noted that they've always known how to deal with frost because it's something they have learned to mitigate over the years. But the sensationalization of mainstream media and the substitution of knowledge of over which they already know has always been problematic for them. Second, community-based safety nets, while informal, should be acknowledged as legitimate and viable components of adaptive governance and deliberative democracy and should be supported institutionally. It should be from a bottom-up approach. Third, protective mechanisms must be established in order to insulate local agricultural economies from the external shocks of a global liberalized trade. Finally, the discussion must include a reparative dimension. Yesterday, we talked about the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, the board of which is currently hosted by the Philippines, and it's very very interesting that we're also having this conversation while they're having B5 in Barbados at the moment. But we argue that this must be operationalized in a way that is accessible to grassroots actors and responsive to their specific needs. We argue that all legal frameworks should do the same thing, both within and outside the UNFCCC discussions. Institutions pursuing climate reparation must integrate indigenous knowledge systems, engage grassroots communities, and recognize the agency of these groups. Reparations in this context, therefore, must be structural and not merely financial. They must involve institutional reform, the protection of indigenous agency, the upholding of their right to self-determination, and the re-evaluation of local epistemologies that have long been sidelined. When it comes to creating policies and opportunities on ways of repair, lived experiences of farmers have to be fully taken into account, lest the theoretical knowledge of the urban center is made to substitute for the practical and lived realities of those in the margins. The truth is that indigenous peoples, not just indigenous farmers in Atok, not just the Ibaloy and the Kankanaey, but indigenous peoples have always understood how to recover, rehabilitate, and repair, whether it be in response to hazards, colonization, government intrusion, or development aggression. However, their voices remain silenced if not completely cast aside. For many indigenous communities, including those in Benguet, the effects of climate change are compounded by a legacy of colonial extraction, displacement, and marginalization. Reparations, therefore, are not solely about climate impacts, but about addressing intergenerational harm that have wrought systems which have long undermined indigenous autonomy. And so to the Atok farmer, reparations means their genuine participation in the aid process. It is not simply attendance, but leadership, not merely identification as stakeholder, but as actor, not merely recipient of aid, but owner of the process. And that their knowledge system, often overlooked by governments insofar as they might not be aligned with modern current knowledge, remains meritorious and should be afforded immense value and approached with care. And a final note, and I think this is my last paragraph as well in the slide, as much as efforts to adequately provide climate reparations are welcome and really, really needed, it is nonetheless argued that perhaps even these concepts require critical rethinking. Right? In a world that quantifies justice in monetary schemes, reparations could risk becoming transactional rather than transformational. And in a world where money, in a neoliberal world, where money is used to equate with repair, and terms like just compensation are used often, especially in the context of indigenous peoples, perhaps there is merit to ask an important question. Is there ever compensation, monetary or otherwise, for the displaced indigenous that is ever truly just? And we argue that cultural heritage, which has been eroded in the indigenous communities in Atok, whether explicit or otherwise, cannot simply be compensated for. And so our work we hope that our work contributes to the literature and the discussions, not just on material support on reparations, but really for the radical recentering of Indigenous voices, of marginalized voices in both discourse and decision making. Thank you, everyone, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you for your presentation, which explained very well how the indigenous farmers of Africa are suffered from the armor damage of climate change, and how they can ask for compensation. Then I will welcome Madame Alana, who is the yes.
Good morning, everyone. Today, what I look at is representation, redress, and reparatory justice in context of Afro-descendant peoples in the Caribbean, small island developing states. And I guess the idea of this came to me, one in the conference advertised, but as I go through the presentation, you will see that there are many proposals and strands of thought on reparations within the Caribbean, specifically in the context of in response to colonial challenges and for the transatlantic slave trade. And there are also simultaneously a lot of climate justice efforts led or where Caribbean small island developing states participate, but there needs to be some coordination or synergy. So these are just some preliminary thoughts as to how this can come together, perhaps. Now, by way of context, when I speak of the Caribbean, I'm essentially speaking of this group of countries, and specifically these are countries of CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, and another sub-grouping called the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, which will become apparent why I've selected these. Now, in the main, these states have one main, I suppose, common thread running through them. Apart from being colonized, these are all former colonies of the United Kingdom, which along with Haiti and Suriname, colonies of France and the Netherlands respectively, form the Caribbean Community. So these are 15 states, including Montserrat, which is still overseas dependent territory. So but we're not going to get into that. Now, essentially, this area was discovered, quote unquote, by Columbus in 1492, and its original peoples were various indigenous peoples who were spread across their 3 main archipelagos, and of course, you have 2 mainland, South and Central America. Now, essentially, what happened in rapid succession was most of these indigenous peoples were annihilated. So today in the Caribbean, very few Caribbean states have indigenous peoples. These would be Belize, Guyana, Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which have what we would call the Garifuna, which are a mixture of indigenous people and slaves that would have escaped from ships and so on. And essentially, therefore, the area was almost entirely repopulated by the importation of African slaves through the transatlantic slave trade. And when slavery was abolished in 1834, for which there were significant reparations to persons who owned slaves, there was a variety of indentured servants. Now, these came primarily from Asia, but some states have indentured servants from Ireland and Scotland, I believe, yes. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm focusing on the Afro-descendant peoples. In the context of reparations, some believe that all persons impacted by the slave trade should, or colonialism, I should say, more accurately, should be eligible for reparations. And there are those who say only those who have been impacted directly by the slave trade. But that is a discussion for another day. Now, without exception, all of these states in the Caribbean are now contextualized as small island developing states. As you know, SIDS are spread across the Caribbean, the Pacific, some in the Indian Ocean, and there's some in Africa. Now, this categorization impacts their economies, actually has inherent characteristics. They're small, literally small islands. Their ability to be resilient to shocks, economic, ecological, and so is quite low. And colonialism, which essentially would have harvested most of their terrestrial resources, has left huge disproportionalities. One thing to note is that most of these states are, however, what we call large ocean states. In this context, the ocean is probably the last remaining frontier of economic exploitation. But again, a discussion for another day. So the CARICOM Caribbean community, which is CARICOM, so this is an economic union, I don't want to say like the EU, but similar objectives, but not quite the same operational. So the CARICOM community comprises of 15 states, and within that union is the sub-union of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, which is a group of 9 states almost contiguous in the Eastern Caribbean. And that union also closely associates with Martinique and Guadeloupe, which are overseas territories of France. Right, so against this background, we have increased vulnerability to disasters, specifically droughts, hurricanes, and so on, which have been conclusively linked to, or the increased incidents have been linked to climate threats. Now, the challenge is not only that, the area is prone to hurricanes almost annually. We have a saying that's, every year, June too soon, July standby, August come it must, and so on. So especially if you're in the Antillean chain, you're accustomed to hurricanes. The challenge is they're usually between category 1, category 2, which, persons have adapted to. What we've seen over the last 8 years is what we call category 5+. The hurricane scale is a 5-scale system, and these are hurricanes whose sustained winds are exceeding the upper end of the scale when it was created. And as a result, many states, even if they try to recover from one hurricane before they do, so we have the case of Grenada, in 2024, it was hit by Hurricane Beryl, and it basically decimated, so one of their 3 islands. Persons had to be relocated and so on. Now, Grenada was in the process of recovering from 2 back-to-back hurricanes about 15 years earlier, called Ivan and Emily, which were category 4 hurricanes. So this kind of, you're almost back to, I guess, even footing, and this further set you back. Now, just to put this into perspective, a recent ODI paper found that SIDS collectively lose over US $1.7 billion due to climate change. And as you can see from this graphic, I don't know if you see, the green are CARICOM SIDS. So CARICOM SIDS are the category of SIDS that are most disproportionately affected. And while, one of the things when I hear these loss and damage conversations, people seem to be speaking as if it's in the future, it's, for SIDS, and not, many Caribbean SIDS, certainly loss and damage is here. Now, this disproportionately, so coming directly to the topic of my paper, is that even as a vulnerable group of states, there are persons within these populations who are vulnerable. And, you know, I put some there, but Indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples are often the most vulnerable because they're marginalized and because they have intimate connection with the land. And now there's competition for much of this land, be it coastal land for tourism, or in countries which have large forests for development, either for oil and gas or forests. So the concept of people of African descent or African descendant peoples was defined in the Declaration of Santiago. And essentially, these are persons who would have been transported and would have arrived in different parts of the world because of transatlantic slave trade. Now, in the Latin American Caribbean region, the Latin American Caribbean region has the largest population of Afro-descendants because during the transatlantic slave trade, Brazil, for example, received the most slaves. And in the context of the Caribbean region, the islands I showed you, Afro-descendant peoples represent the main person. So essentially, you would have begun with a population almost exclusively of Indigenous people. And now you have a situation where most of the persons are Afro-descendants. Now, this brings me now to the often difficult discussion as to the difference between Afro-descendant persons, Indigenous persons, which some have tried to lump together. And the conclusion by many authorities, including the Inter-American Court, because there have been several cases, mainly from Suriname, as well as some other Latin American countries, which have clearly and conclusively stated that Afro-descendant culture is developed through a sui generis process. So essentially a combination of what they would have known from Africa, as well as the process of acculturation when they would have arrived into the region. And some territories such as Suriname, Jamaica, Haiti, and Belize and St. Vincent and the Grenadines have the distinction of having both Indigenous and Afro-descendant persons and the mixtures of those persons. So it's quite an interesting dynamic. Yeah. Now, in 2021, the United Nations General Assembly established what is called a permanent forum of Indigenous persons, who is in the process of developing a draft, well, it's currently a draft declaration on human rights of persons of African descent. And that's essentially how I began thinking about this, because they're currently doing visits to different regions of the world. I was asked to put together, I guess, a position paper on, the draft. Right, so one of the key elements, and this is perhaps how it links back to climate change, Afro-descendant peoples, like Indigenous peoples, have a very intimate relationship with the environment, which is severely threatened by climate events. And the other thing I want to note, and this goes to the intergenerational element, which some speakers spoke about yesterday, and which we can speak about in the discussion, is that in the Caribbean and Latin American region, for that matter, because sometimes annoyingly our statistics get lumped together, the region is experiencing the largest percentage of children and youth in its history, which obviously has implications and must be factored into this reparation argument. It means that we are at a junction in history where what we do will impact the largest sector of our population currently. Now, one of the things I mean, I guess I'm an environmental and human rights lawyer, so I thought of looking at it through a human rights. For me, the special rapporteur on in environment. This connection is unstable. Okay, it went. Yeah, put together. Propose this 4-pillar climate justice framework. And it is within this context that I guess my next slide will be framed. So on this slide, what I've put is essentially the main actions that I've taken specifically with respect to reparations. And this has been done in the context of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, as I mentioned, which at the Conference of the Parties, which is the highest decision-making body, would have established the Caribbean Reparations Commission. Now, this commission arose out of the discussion that there needs to be some compensatory mechanism for the atrocities of slavery, colonialism, and the impact on colonial societies. And it was largely driven by a book written by Sir Hilary Beckles, who happens to be the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies and the current chair of the commission. So there are a set of actions I put there that occurred as a result. I'm sorry, I should have put the year. This is about 2016, I believe. So it led to the establishment of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which is the Regional Reparations Commission. Now, each state has a National Reparations Committee. The University of the West Indies, so University of the West Indies was launched as a public university so that, you know, persons within the Caribbean could have an institution to go to, so as you see there, unlock the potential for economic and cultural growth and improve regional autonomy. And this, during the 60s, this was very popular because independence was sweeping through the Caribbean region. And finally, the CARICOM proposed a 10-point action plan specifically focused on reparations for the slave trade and the associated impacts of colonialism. That's my phrasing because, as you will see, and I think we'll go into, this action plan, while it says reparations, is not, and this is where some of the controversy comes in with it. It's looking at reparations for all persons in the Caribbean. And as I have here, so these are the main areas of the current action plan. And as you see, the climate change was not in the thoughts when this was developed. Though we can see there are elements which align with current discourse on reparations and climate justice, so such as debt cancellation, technology transfer, and indigenous development, and so on. But so as it is right now, this action plan needs to be revamped and streamlined, which you'll hear more from. Now, against all of that, what I did is kind of pull together the different strands of where CARICOM Small Island Developing States have proposed to specifically address reparations and have relevance to climate justice. So unquestionably, the regional and historical based approaches with respect to the reparation, CARICOM Reparations Commission, Caribbean Reparations Commission, and the 10-point action plan is Germany. What will need to be done is to have some greater integration of not only the element of climate justice, but human rights-based approaches. And I have a point there. There's need to link it to the CARICOM Charter of Civil Society, which essentially is a human rights document developed and endorsed by CARICOM. The last 23 years just sat there, and nobody seems to be realizing that there's an interrelationship between climate justice and reparations, and the document that you have really, which can guide. I have there this concept of reparations. Even before we started, we have many eminent publicists, I call them publicists, such as Walter Rodney, whose seminal publication I recommend that you read, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. We have M. Césaire from Martinique, Eric Williams. These are, some of my favorite authors, and most of these would have been writing in the 50s, 60s, just about pre-independence. So, and of course, we have the Center for Reparations Research. Now, the University of the West Indies also supports the National Reparations Committee, and so far in 2023, I believe, we would have collectively got the Grenadian National Reparations Committee would have got not only an apology from a family involved in the slave trade, but also some monetary compensation. The university has also phases and an implementation phase. Please say that I was able to contribute to this. Now, the final category, and this perhaps ties within what, loss and damage and so on, but these are financial-based reparatory measures. I believe it was Joy who mentioned that the debt burden and the interest rates and so on do not favor, or the international financial system does not favor small island developing or any developing state for that matter. And the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, has proposed the Bridgetown Initiative, which is a plan that is proposed to address elements of the international financial system. And this is not alone. France and Vanuatu have collectively put together a plan called the IFIRO Action Plan, which has many of the same or objectives. And finally, in the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl last year, so Hurricane Beryl was a Category 5+ storm, and she was the first. She named many first. She developed rapidly. She literally went from a tropical storm to a Category 2 to a Category 5 in less than 24 hours, if I recall. And she decimated some of the Grenadines. So the Grenadines are shared between St. Vincent. I find visuals are better. So St. Vincent would be here. So St. Vincent and Grenada are two contiguous states. And in the middle here are what we call the Grenadines. So half of which are owned by St. Vincent, or more than half actually, and two of which are owned by Grenada. So she would have decimated the one closer to Grenada and some in St. Vincent. And in the aftermath, the governments of Antigua and Barbuda, Grenada, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines wrote to the British government asking for equivalent of the Marshall Plan in relation to this context. Of course, now with all the changes, I'm not sure how far that's going to go. One of the reasons I should also mention quickly that Antigua and Barbuda would have been the state along with Vanuatu, which would have taken the advisory opinion to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. So I guess in conclusion, I think what I want to say is that certainly in the Caribbean region, there has been a lot of consideration for reparations for specifically people of African descent, given their the large predominance in the region. But what I want to say is that the thoughts on reparations has been almost operating on parallel tracks with a lot of critical and important initiatives directly aimed at climate justice. So I think my conclusion is that there needs to be a more holistic and consideration and streamlining as to how, because they're, in my opinion, part of the same puzzle, or part of the same approach. Maybe not puzzle is not better. And I think the tenets found in the 10-point action plan are going to be critical to charting this way forward, and addressing the injustices and imbalances. And as I want to just circle back to the fact that the majority of the region is youth and children, and this is something we need to do for them. And, you know, not only for their future, but also to pass a lot of the intergenerational knowledge and so on, and ensure that they actually have somewhere to use it. Yeah, so that's me. Hopefully you followed me as even as I was thinking about this morning, so many other things are occurring to me. So it really is a work in progress. And yeah, feel free to ask me any questions, and yes, contact.
Okay. So thank you all, and greetings from England. And want to talk today about, well, a topic that really follows from the previous presentations, from genocide domination to climate vulnerability to new horizons of responsibility, the question of reparations in the case of the Caribbean. And this grows out of a British Academy grant that Vicky and I got on the question of the relationship between genocide and the ocean, with special reference to the Caribbean. And just really following up from Lana's presentation, so in talking about the CARICOM reparations claims, so many traditions of them, quite a historical lineage of them, but then most really considered the legacies of enslavement. But with CARICOM's most recent 10-point plan, there's also been the inclusion of indigenous genocide in relation to slavery. And then, of course, this generates numerous questions. Then where does climate change fit in here? So we could think about one of the great issues with this inclusion is that so much of the discourse surrounding reparations for for colonialism against indigenous peoples are really rooted in the context of white English-speaking settler colonies, Canada, Australia, the US. So what does that mean for other contexts? What does that mean for the Caribbean, where the majority of people are Afro-descended who ended up there historically because of the transatlantic slave trade? So what does it then mean to include indigenous reparations within this general frame? Some have pointed to this matter of, well, CARICOM member states, Suriname, Belize, to give two examples, do not exactly have the best records when it comes to treatment of indigenous peoples. And when this is put in the context of reparations, what does this mean in terms of division of different claimant communities? So in coming up with a concept to try to really capture that diversity of experiences, but within a greater totality, one phrase that Vicky and I are experimenting with is this notion of a genocide-enabled domination. So the idea that colonial genocide by various European powers in the Caribbean ended up this precondition for plantation enslavement. So the dispossession of land and then the dispossession of people, of bodies, are really happening in relation to this greater relational whole. And this is imprinted in nature itself, in what some have deemed the Plantationocene. Even after emancipation, there's still the continuity of it in that it's just so ingrained within the earth, etched into the environment, and continuing in numerous capacities. So what theory of reparations might be helpful in just expanding our horizons when confronting this problem of genocide-enabled domination? And here we're turning to Robert Meister's theory in After Evil, where he says that, okay, we have the standard assumption of this lost base approach, really premised on, well, tort law, this idea that there was harm, there has to be some sort of quantifiable compensation of it. And then, of course, the longer back you go in relation to the harm, the more difficult quantification becomes, the more supervening factors can become involved. And then, of course, reparations should be about more than quantification, yet that element becomes unavoidable through these models. So what Meister offers is, what if we think about reparations not in relation to loss, or not exclusively in relation to loss, but also in relation to gain? So what did historic commissioners of injustice do? How was that wealth accumulated? How did it pass on to others? And here he uses or Meister uses the model of the common law constructive trust, where assets can be traced. And the initial claimant, who was wrongfully dispossessed of their trust assets, can follow the asset, but also trace it into the transference of different forms. So land that was appropriated or expropriated and then sold, the claimant still has that claim to the proceeds from it. So again, this raises a huge number of questions, but a set of questions that we believe are very appropriate to discussing this case of climate reparations in relation to the Caribbean. And now I will turn it over to Vicky.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. And I will try to connect the dots. And what I'm doing today is connecting the genocide-enabled domination with the ICJ, which is actually our contribution, our doctrinal contribution, trying to go a little bit beyond the conventional approaches. So to begin with, the framework of genocide-enabled domination becomes even more urgent in light of what is termed the coloniality of climate change. And you will see why it is important to start with this in order to bridge the vulnerabilities that are taking place, the reparations, and how these have been approached, and then see how the ICJ expected advisory opinion can add on this. So the very states that were once colonized are now disproportionately climate vulnerable, which is actually a structural injustice that cannot be separated from the historical trajectories of wealth accumulation in the global north. Now, colonialism and slavery not only enriched European imperial powers, fueling the Industrial Revolution and by extension excess greenhouse gas emissions, but also established a global economic model of extractivism from the global south. This model continues to exacerbate environmental degradation and inequality. And post-colonial states, already disadvantaged by the impoverishment and ecological destruction wrought by colonial rule, remain vulnerable owing to persistent neocolonial dynamics that undermine their governance. So these dynamics are key factors in shaping their climate vulnerability. And also, as we can see that they find themselves at the front line of planetary crisis, to which they have contributed the least. And this is the crucial word where we are stepping on in order to talk about the doctrine of specially affected states and also the common but differentiated responsibilities. Now, taking into account that these post-colonial states have contributed the least, we see a triangular relationship emerging, which combines the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities with the doctrine of specially affected states, the long dormant doctrine that was for the first time mentioned in 1969 in the North Sea continental shelf case, and then it was never brought up again. Of course, we recognize that there are some gaps because the ICJ at this period of time never mentioned or defined, legally interpreted the doctrine of specially affected states. But we are trying here with Eric to draw the links and between genocide, reparations, and how this can be incorporated into the post-colonial states and the small island states that have been especially affected by the climate change ramifications. So to start with the common but differentiated responsibilities, post-colonial states, particularly those in the global south, have historically contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions, but bear the brunt of climate change impacts. Now, the CBDR, this is an established principle, and also it has been recognized in international climate agreements, such as the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement 2015, and which affirms that while all states share a responsibility for addressing climate change, developed countries must take the lead due to their historical emissions and greater financial technological capacities. Now, think like if the ICJ advisory opinion affirms the CBDR as a binding principle in customary international law, post-colonial states could argue historical emitters that they have a heightened duty to provide reparations, mitigation efforts, and adaptation support. So here we ask the question why the doctrine of specially affected states is a crucial tool for state responsibility, reparations, and loss and damage funding, and how this doctrine can be reinforced through its interplay with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Here we have some, maybe because of the time restrictions, we have some ideas that we'd like to share with you, give you a taste of how we're trying to push the doctrinal boundaries, which is actually our main contribution here. So, according to the ICJ's jurisprudence, states that suffer disproportionate harm from a global phenomenon can influence the development of customary international law. And this is the way we use actually the doctrine of specially affected states in custom formation. So the North Sea continental shelf case in 1969 established that the practice of specially affected states carries significant weight in crystallizing norms into binding international obligations. Now, this was also mentioned in Nicaragua v. United States 1986 case, where the ICJ emphasized that states with a direct and substantial stake in an issue can shape the interpretation of legal principles, even against the position of dominant powers. Now, let's see how this can be applied to climate justice. Small island development states and other post-colonial states that have suffered existential risks should be recognized as specially affected actors in international climate law. Here, we would say that we need to emphasize their unique vulnerability and historical marginalization, where these states can use to compel stronger obligations on major polluters in shaping the duty to mitigate, adapt, and provide reparations. Now, hypothetical scenario, if the ICJ affirms that the standing of these states as specially affected, it could strengthen their legal claims for climate reparations and adaptation finance, drawing a direct link between harm suffered and state responsibility under international law. And I'm going to explain further below what I mean by that. So connecting, first of all, specially affected states to CBDR. While CBDR generally differentiates responsibilities based on capacity and historical emissions, the doctrine of specially affected states reinforces the argument that certain states, particularly post-colonial low-emission nations, should be prioritized in climate reparations. So this provides a stronger foundation for, first, binding obligations on major emitters under the no-harm principle enshrined in customary international law, and the ICJ's 1949 Corfu Channel case, where the ICJ in the Corfu Channel case affirmed that states have a duty not to knowingly allow their territory to be used for activities that harm other states. And the second point is the duty to prevent transboundary harm, which was reaffirmed in the Pulp Mills case in 2010, among other cases, of course, but and could be extended to climate-related obligations. So this is how this provides a strong legal foundation for, and then strengthening climate reparations and loss and damage claims, we could use the ICJ's advisory opinion on climate change that could recognize that climate damage caused by historical emissions is a form of a wrongful act, triggering state responsibility under the Articles on Responsibility of States for International Wrongful Acts, the ARCIVA 2001, and in particular, under Article 31 of the ARCIVA, where states responsible for wrongful acts must provide full reparation, which could justify enhanced climate finance and loss and damage funds for specially affected states. So bringing it all together, we have here some questions that Eric and I were working towards based on our British Academy funding. So the idea is how we can apply the theory into practice, circumventing the practical challenges and focusing on the enforcement aspect of reparations, because especially with the climate reparations and how we combine this, the enforcement is always something that escapes at the end of the day. So, and also what's the structures of international cooperation, what kind of forms this climate cooperation can take, the international cooperation can take. But I would like to go back a little bit again and to the doctrine of specially affected states and ask, why does it matter in this case? And that's the reason why we used the Caribbean case as an example, as a case study, to combine the genocide-enabled domination with the coloniality of the climate change. So again, the potential that this doctrine, the specially affected states doctrine, offers is that if the ICJ confirms that post-colonial states are specially affected, which remains to be seen that, as I mentioned, this doctrine has never been used again, so it lacks the legal interpretation, they can argue that CBDR alone is insufficient and demand that, first, climate reparations be framed as a legal obligation rather than a discretionary political gesture that it is at this stage. Secondly, we have the polluter pays principle, which has been recognized in international environmental law and has not been used adequately so far, which extends beyond mitigation to historical accountability, because these post-colonial states, they don't suffer only from the past, the historical injustices, but also it's like a domino effect that continues these injustices with the impact from the implication from the climate change, which has exacerbated their vulnerability. So, where am I now? Yes, to conclude. To conclude, If the ICJ considers the doctrine of specially affected states, and this is what we are pushing for actually, and with what Alana mentioned earlier, our work that we are doing with the Curriculum Preparations Commission, it will first expand state responsibility beyond voluntary commitments, potentially strengthening legal claims in international tribunals, compel major polluters to accept strong legal duties under the UNFCCC, particularly in financing climate adaptation and loss and damage, using the model that Eric presented, Robert Meister's model, and also provide a legal foundation for claims in domestic and regional courts, pushing for accountability beyond diplomatic negotiations. And this is our contribution. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much to both for your presentation. Then we can conclude with the last one for this morning with Barrett Ristroff. I don't know if she's in the room or online.
I think it's online.
Okay, good.
Okay, I apologize. I'm going to turn off my video just to try to make the sound quality a little bit better. In 2023, with funding from international donors, Fiji was able to develop the first ever set of standard operating procedures that could relocate communities on customarily owned lands threatened by climate change. Appreciate the comment early from Jamila that there's not really any adequate compensation for this, but it is something that many Pacific Islands are experiencing, and also in Alaska and other places where I have worked. But Fiji is developing standard operating procedures that try to marry Pacific Island customs with internationally recognized human rights, or what I call United Nations human rights. So in line with concepts of human rights, the procedures require 90% consensus to move from each of several groups. You can see the groups here on the screen. And then the decision on where to relocate requires the consensus of 60% of the residents in each of these groups. And nodding at custom, the procedures empower the person known as the traditional village headman to be in charge of having meetings to get the consensus. And they also recognize that customary land can't be bought or sold. Also, in terms of custom, negotiations for the right to live at the new site take place through the village headman, following the traditional protocols. But I point out the issue that there's a limited number of openly gay people in many traditional Pacific Island villages. And so I was wondering what happens if there's only one person in a village who identifies as LGBTQ+, and this person vetoes the relocation. So does this mean that the village has to stay in place, even if 90% of the other residents and the village leadership want to see the relocation go forward? And then what happens if the village leadership decides to use their traditional authority to banish the person who's not in favor of relocation? This is something that's happened before with drug dealers being banished. But this is just one example of the thorny questions that can come up when you have external concepts of human rights that appear to contradict Pacific Island values and customs. And these contradictions can add another layer of—
Interrupt. We're not seeing your slides change, just very quickly. Thank you. This is, yeah, now we can see them. Thanks.
Okay, do you not see my slides at all, or you're—
We see them. They were just not going from one to the next.
Okay, I had not changed them yet.
Sorry to interrupt your flow.
Oh, that's fine. I only had a few slides, so let me go ahead and change to the next slides. Just to make sure, you're seeing the next slide, the outline?
Yes.
Your seconds.
Perfect. Okay. Okay. This is what I'm talking about with the issue of the consensus. It's just one of the questions that are going to come up when you have external concepts of human rights that seem like they contradict Pacific Island values. And I'm using the example of Fiji because it's important. It was the first one to develop these standard operating procedures for relocation. And it may be a model that other Pacific Island countries build on. So my presentation is about the potential conflicts between human rights and practices and values in the concept of international donors who are funding climate change adaptation and relocation. And mainly I look at planned community relocations. And what I'm going to do first is give an overview of the so-called Western, or also international, human rights, United Nations rights, And I summarize some key values and customs of residents of Pacific Islands, many of whom are part of Indigenous communities. And I talk about customs that could potentially conflict with UN human rights. And I go on to talk about the potential for conflicts regarding funding for these small island states to adapt to climate change and relocation. And then I look at ways that climate change conflicts might be addressed. And I kind of build on the previous presentation talking about the responsibility of the larger states to the smaller states. And so unlike the previous presentations, this is not, no one is talking about an agreement for loss and damage in the work that I'm doing, that I am urging that framework of loss and damage to apply here. So looking at the UN human rights, we often hear, you heard me refer to them as Western earlier. Some people say, no, they're universal. But when human rights parlance first came out, that was with the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it was predominantly Western countries involved. The victors of World War II were leading the drafting. At that time, there were only 56 members of the United Nations, and many of the countries, including Pacific Island countries, were still colonized. And back then, there was not a lot of mention of the rights of women and children, no mention of the rights of LGBTQ plus individuals or people with disabilities or community rights or traditional peoples. And UN human rights have evolved since then. Most significant for Indigenous communities is moving beyond historical Western concepts of rights as individual entitlements towards community rights, particularly in the context of Indigenous peoples. And we can say maybe this started with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or ICCPR, and maybe peaked with the non-binding 2007 Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. The 1989 International Labor Organization's Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, also known as ILO 169, is significant because now we're finally talking about customs. So you can see here that it requires due regard to Indigenous customs, but within the confines of the United Nations rights. This is just a chart showing that as time has gone by, and increasingly just at the beginning of the century, a number of Pacific Island countries have adopted major UN human rights treaties and some of the protocols associated with it. But not all of them, and sometimes when they were adopting, they've expressed reservations about certain aspects of the agreements. For example, Federated States of Micronesia indicated that it was not prepared to ensure women received equal pay or paid maternity leave. Neither is the United States. Samoa indicated that it could direct resources to private religious schools to fulfill the right to education. So while UN human rights have evolved over time to better address the collective rights of Pacific Island communities, or at least those considered Indigenous, many of the key treaties have still not been fully ratified or accepted. So this is going to sound overly simplistic, but I just want to point out some of the key aspects of Pacific values that can differ from so-called Western values. Pacific values generally emphasize culture, and spirituality, and community, sharing, reciprocity, and ties to the land, often over individual rights. At the same time, individual dignity and respect are important. Customs may continue to be upheld by chiefs and elders whose authority predates colonization. Of course, customs have changed over time, and this is true in Pacific Islands as well as other societies. Christianity and colonization had profound impacts on Pacific Island societies in terms of introducing the values that were in vogue in Western cultures at the time of contact. And in many cases, Pacific Island values and indigenized versions of colonial Christianity have been intertwined. So that can mean different views on rights of women, children, and LGBTQ+ than what is now accepted in UN instruments. I don't think I have to convince anyone here that the human rights of vulnerable groups are important in the context of climate change, because climate change can have disproportionate impacts on people who are already experiencing difficulties that are exercising their rights. We know that women are disproportionately affected by climate disasters. It increases their risk for gender-based violence and disrupts access to healthcare. Persons with disabilities can face marginalization and discrimination that reduce their ability to adapt. And vulnerable groups in the areas most affected by climate change may be unable to relocate in response if they choose to do so. Only in the last decade has there been meaningful consideration of human rights in the context of responding to climate change. And I don't need to go into the details of the various instruments. I think you all are the experts. But just as we are recognizing now how climate change can impact and implicate human rights, we're also seeing how funding to address climate change can disregard UN human rights as well as the customs of many communities. A 2018 Human Rights Council report outlined some of the major violations that mitigation projects have perpetrated, including destroying food sources and housing. Human rights and custom both can be violated when project funders don't go through the proper channels to obtain free, prior, informed consent from local communities. So the violations that I'm talking about are supposed to be addressed by the environmental and social policies that most donors have. On the left side of the screen are some of the policies I reviewed for this research. And most of them provide for human rights generally. Usually there's some gender non-discrimination language and some form of consultation, but none of them fully acknowledge the full range of customs that are important to Pacific Island countries. Different policies maybe recognize different components. And I show on the right hand of the screen some of these components that I think are important to custom. Problematically, many donor funding policies don't require free, prior, informed consent in all situations affecting local communities. They only limit it to certain cases that involve indigenous peoples. And many of the policies don't seem to anticipate how to address the customary local protocols for consultations, which traditionally have excluded certain groups. Now I'm bringing us back to that first slide that I showed. We know that Pacific Island adaptation and community relocation is going to take some external aid. And this means that the donor social and environmental policies that are built roughly on UN human rights is going to come into play, not just during the actual relocation, but also in the design of the relocation policies. That was true for the standard operating procedures for Fiji. They were written in collaboration with the German Development Fund. Also, New Zealand has been a key financier and influencer. They conditioned their contribution to Fiji's Climate Relocation and Displaced Peoples Trust Fund on Fiji finalizing these procedures. Okay, so UN human rights are important, and why is it a problem that we're requiring people to use them? The answer is that respect for Pacific Island custom and an understanding of colonial histories is also important to meaningfully implement relocation efforts. Pacific Island countries may be reluctant to accept the rules of colonial powers who bear the responsibility for climate change while doing little to address the source of climate change in their own countries. I mentioned earlier there can be conflicts in perceptions of rights of women and LGBTQ+ persons, as well as conflicts around rights to land and who has recognized rights. The Fiji procedures strike a delicate balance between UN human rights and Pacific Island custom in addressing these conflicts, but it is a very delicate balance. And now I want to bring us to the way forward. In my research, I talk about several ways for addressing the conflicts between UN human rights and Pacific Island custom. But what I want to focus on here is the idea of maybe not conditioning climate change aid on whether a country is adhering to the donor's concept of human rights. Instead, aid for adaptation and relocation could be considered compensation for loss and damage. And those of you here are more familiar with the recent steps in connection with the UN framework to move forward with the Loss and Damage Fund, and you know we have a long way to go. I want to emphasize that my goal in presenting this and researching this is not to disparage UN human rights. Instead, I just want to point out, like I did last slide, that Western society and the global North have contributed a lot to climate change, and they've also perpetrated mitigation measures that did not take into account either UN human rights or custom. And yet we're asking these Pacific Island countries that didn't contribute much and who are suffering and even being displaced, we're asking them to adhere to these Western-oriented human rights that seem like they're still being colonized. But Fiji and other countries have already begun the difficult task of trying to balance the UN human rights with custom and the realities on the ground. I conclude with the thought that if immediate climate aid is warranted in light of the humanitarian crisis around climate displacement, then donor policies could focus less on checking boxes to comply with UN human rights and more on what's most feasible to fully address the loss and damages that communities are experiencing. Thank you.